The shrill sound of the telephone cut through the early morning silence, rousing Arya Walker from a restless sleep. Her heart raced instantly, as if she already knew something was wrong. With trembling fingers, she groped for the bedside table, knocking over a glass of water before finally reaching for her cell phone. "Hello?" Her voice came out hoarse, laden with apprehension. "Arya, darling." Her aunt's voice sounded distant and embarrassed. "It's your mother. She fainted. We're at the hospital." Arya's world collapsed at that moment. Images of her mother, Vivian, always so strong and vibrant, invaded her mind. The warm smile, the sparkling eyes, the hands always busy with some artistic project. How could this be happening? "I'm coming over now," Arya replied, already getting up and frantically searching for her clothes in the dark room. The drive to the hospital seemed endless. Every red light was torture, every slow-moving car in front of her an insurmountable obstacle. When she finally arrived, Arya ran through the aseptic corridors, the smell of disinfectant invading her nostrils and bringing back memories of other hospital visits, none of them pleasant. She found her aunt in the waiting room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Where is she? What happened?" Arya asked breathlessly. "The doctors are still with her," her aunt replied, pulling her into a tight hug. "She's been so tired lately, but you know her mother, always saying everything's fine." Arya nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. She should have realized, should have insisted more that her mother see a doctor. The next few hours dragged by in an agony of waiting and uncertainty. When a doctor finally appeared, his grave countenance made Arya's stomach churn. "Miss Walker?" the doctor asked, holding out his hand. "I'm Dr. Victor Harlan. Can we talk in private?" Arya followed the doctor into a small consulting room, her heart hammering against her chest. Dr. Harlan indicated a chair and sat down opposite her, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. "Miss Walker, your mother's preliminary examinations indicate a rather rare and worrying," he began, his voice soft but firm. "It is an autoimmune disease that is affecting multiple organs. It's a condition that requires immediate and specialized treatment." Arya felt the air escape from her lungs. But she'll be fine, right? There is a treatment, right?" Dr. Harlan hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around briefly before returning to her. "There is a treatment, yes. However, it's an experimental protocol and extremely expensive. What's more, I'm one of the few specialists in the world qualified to administer it." Arya's initial relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. How much would this treatment cost?" "Much more than most people can afford, unfortunately," Dr. Harlan replied, leaning forward. "But perhaps we can come to an agreement." Something in the way he said this made Arya feel uncomfortable. She shifted in her chair, feeling a chill run down her spine. "What kind of agreement?" Dr. Harlan smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his doctors. "Miss Walker, I'm a very busy and valued man. My time is precious. But I am willing to treat your mother personally, ensuring that she receives the best possible care." Arya felt a spark of hope. "That would be wonderful, doctor. How can we make that happen?" "It's simple, really," he replied, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "In exchange for your mother's treatment, you will meet with me on a daily basis to fulfill certain needs of mine." Arya's stomach churned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're asking me to be intimately involved with me, yes," Dr. Harlan added, without a hint of shame in his voice. "It's a fair exchange, don't you think? Your mother's life for a few moments of your time." Arya stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. That's unethical. It's illegal. I could report you right now." Dr. Harlan remained impassive, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You could. But then, who would treat your mother? Who would save her life? Think about it, Miss Walker. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the sake of those we love." Arya felt tears burning her eyes, anger and despair fighting inside her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run away, but the image of her mother, frail and ill, held her in place. I need time to think," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "Of course," Dr. Harlan replied, standing up, "but don't take too long. Time is not in your mother's favor." Arya left the room in a whirlwind of emotions, her world turning upside down. How could she make such a decision? How could she choose between her integrity and her mother's life? As she walked back to the waiting room, Arya felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She knew that, whatever her decision, nothing would ever be the same. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, each tick reminding her that time was running out. With a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, Arya prepared to face her aunt and, eventually, her mother. But how could she look Vivian in the eye knowing the price she would have to pay to save her? And how could she not pay that price, knowing that it was her mother's only chance? The day had barely begun and Arya already felt exhausted, as if she had lived a lifetime in those few hours. As the sun rose outside, bringing a new day to the world, it seemed to Arya that darkness was only just beginning to set in. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the hospital room, casting dancing shadows over Vivian's pale face. Arya watched her mother, so frail in bed, so different from the vibrant woman she had always known. Dr. Harlan's words echoed in her mind, an indecent proposal that haunted her every breath. "Darling," Vivian's weak voice broke the silence. "You look so worried." Arya forced a smile, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding her mother's hand. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just tired. How are you feeling?" Vivian tried to adjust herself on the bed, a grimace of pain crossing her face. "I've been better, but don't worry. I'll be fine." Her mother's optimism was like a knife in Arya's heart. If only she had known. If she could have imagined the weight of the decision Arya was carrying. "Mom," Arya began hesitantly, "Dr. Harlan talked about an experimental treatment. He said it's our best chance, but it's expensive, isn't it?" Vivian added, her eyes full of understanding. "Oh dear, I don't want you to worry about that. I've lived a good life, you know." Arya felt tears burn her eyes. "Don't talk like that. We'll find a way, I promise." Just then, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. A young nurse entered, his gentle smile lighting up the gloomy room. "Good morning, ladies. I'm Leo, the nurse on duty. I've come to check Mrs. Clark's vital signs." As Leo worked, Arya watched him. There was something in his smooth movements, in his gentle way of speaking to Vivian, that calmed her. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world where people like Leo and not Dr. Harlan were in control. "Miss Walker," Leo's voice brought her back to reality. "Could I speak to you for a moment outside?" In the hallway, far from Vivian's ears, Leo lowered his voice. "Sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing how distressed you looked. Is everything all right?" Something in the sincerity of his eyes made Arya almost collapse. "It's complicated," she murmured. Leo nodded understandingly. "Look, I know we don't know each other, but if you need to talk, sometimes an impartial ear can help." Arya hesitated. Could she trust him? But the weight of the secret was suffocating her. "Dr. Harlan," she began, her voice almost a whisper, He made an offer to treat my mother." Leo's expression changed subtly. "What kind of offer?" The words came out in a torrent, Arya unable to contain them. When she had finished, she felt exhausted but strangely relieved. Leo stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and indignation. This is completely unethical," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Arya, you can't accept this. There has to be another way." "But what if there isn't?" Arya asked, her voice breaking. "What if it's my mother's only chance?" Leo gently took her hands. "Listen, I know it seems hopeless right now, but I promise we'll find a solution. You're not alone in this." At that moment, Dr. Harlan appeared at the end of the corridor, his cold eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. He approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Miss Walker, can we talk? In private?" Leo squeezed Arya's hands lightly before walking away. "Remember what I said," he muttered. Alone with Dr. Harlan, Arya felt her stomach contract. "Doctor, I hope you've considered my offer," he interrupted her, his voice low and threatening. "The clock is ticking and your mother needs to start treatment soon." Arya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. When she opened them again, she saw Leo in the distance, watching them with concern. I accept," she whispered, the words coming out of her mouth like poison. "Doctor," Harlan smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent decision, Miss Walker. We'll begin treatment immediately. As for our meetings, we'll start tonight. My office, 8 p.m. As he walked away, Arya felt as if she had sold her soul. She staggered to the nearest bathroom, barely making it in time before she vomited violently. Minutes later, washing her face with cold water, Arya stared at her reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman looking back at her? How had she gotten to this point? A soft knock on the door startled her. "Arya, is everything all right?" Leo's worried voice came from the other side. Taking a deep breath, Arya opened the door. "No," she answered honestly. "Nothing's fine." Leo watched her for a moment before speaking. "You accepted, didn't you?" Arya nodded, unable to find words. "Listen," Leo said, his voice firm. "This isn't over. I'm going to investigate Dr. Harlan. There's something wrong here, and we're going to find out what it is. Don't give up, okay?" For the first time that day, Arya felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Back in Vivian's room, Arya watched her mother sleeping peacefully, oblivious to her daughter's torment. Treatment would begin soon, thanks to the sacrifice Arya was about to make. As the day progressed, Arya mentally prepared herself for what was to come. Night was approaching, bringing with it the promise of an encounter she dreaded more than anything. But in the depths of her despair, a small light shone through. Leo's promise to help her, to investigate, to find a way out. It was a fragile hope, but it was all Arya had to cling to as she walked towards the darkness that awaited her. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a cruel contrast to the darkness that was settling into Arya's soul. She walked through the hospital corridors, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Each step took her closer to Dr. Harlan's office, closer to the abyss she had agreed to enter. When she reached the door, her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. For a moment, she considered running away, disappearing into the night and never looking back. But the image of her mother, frail and ill, anchored her in place. With a shaky sigh, she turned the knob. The office was dark, lit only by a single desk lamp. Dr. Harlan was sitting behind his desk, a predatory smile on his lips. "Ah, Miss Walker," punctual as expected. Arya felt her stomach twist. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, closing her eyes. But before Dr. Harlan could move, the door opened abruptly. Leo entered panting, followed by a man Arya didn't immediately recognize. "Arya, wait," Leo exclaimed. "You don't have to do this." Dr. Harlan stood up furious. "What does that mean? Get out of here immediately." The unknown man stepped forward and suddenly Arya recognized him. It was Julian, her brother, whom she hadn't seen for years. "Arya," Julian said, his voice deep and urgent. "Leo contacted me. We've discovered something you need to know." Dr. Harlan tried to intervene, but Julian ignored him, focusing on his sister. "The treatment he's offering. It's not as exclusive as he wants you to believe. There are other doctors, other hospitals that can help Mom." Arya felt her legs go weak, falling into a nearby chair. "What?" "But he said—" Leo approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He lied, Arya. It was all a manipulation to get what he wanted from you." Dr. Harlan, seeing his plan fall apart, tried to regain control of the situation. "This is absurd. I'm trying to save her mother's life." "No, you're taking advantage of her desperation," Julian retorted, his voice filled with restrained anger. He turned to Arya. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, that I let you deal with all this on your own. But I'm here now, and we're going to sort this out together." Arya looked at her brother, seeing in him the boy she had grown up with and the man he had become. Tears began to stream down her face, a mixture of relief and anguish. "Julian, I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to save Mom." Julian hugged her, and in that moment, years of distance and resentment dissolved. "I know, little sister, I know." Dr. Harlan, seeing that he was losing control, tried one last card. "You have no proof of any of this. It's your word against mine, and I'm a respected doctor." Leo stepped forward, his eyes shining with determination. "Actually, doctor, we do have proof. While you were busy with your schemes, I was investigating. I have documents, emails, even recordings of other victims of yours." Dr. Harlan's face paled visibly. "You can't. This is invasion of privacy. And what were you about to do to my sister?" Julian retorted, his voice dangerously low. Arya stood up, feeling a strength she didn't know she possessed. "It's over, Dr. Harlan. You're not going to hurt anyone anymore." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline her words, the door opened again. This time it was two policemen, accompanied by the hospital director. "Dr. Victor Harlan," one of the officers announced, "you are in custody for questioning on allegations of misconduct and extortion." As Dr. Harlan was led away, protesting and threatening lawsuits, Arya found herself wrapped in a triple hug with Julian and Leo. The relief she felt was almost palpable, but it was soon replaced by a new wave of worry. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's going to happen to Mom?" Julian smiled, a smile so reminiscent of his mother's that it made Arya's heart ache. "I've already taken care of that. I've contacted a specialist in Boston. He's willing to take on Mom's case and start treatment immediately." "But how are we going to pay for it?" Arya asked, the financial reality still weighing on her mind. "Together," Julian replied simply. "I have some savings, and I'm sure we can get help. The important thing is that we're not alone anymore." Leo, who had stepped aside to give the brothers some privacy, approached again. I'd like to help too, if you allow me. I know some support organizations that can help with the costs." Arya looked at Leo, seeing in him not just the dedicated nurse, but a friend, perhaps even something more. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As they left the office, Arya felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The future was still uncertain. Her mother's treatment would still be a challenge, but for the first time in days she felt hope. In Vivian's room they found her awake, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Julian. "My boy," she whispered, holding out her arms. Julian ran to embrace her, tears in both their eyes. Arya watched the scene, her heart filling with love and gratitude. They were a family again, united against adversity. As night fell over the city, bringing with it the stars that had once seemed so far away, Arya knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The darkness that had threatened to engulf her had been dispelled, replaced by the light of hope and familial love. And there, in that hospital room, with her mother, her brother, and a new friend by her side, Arya made a silent promise. She would never again allow despair to lead her to compromise her values. The journey ahead would be difficult, but with love, support, and integrity, they would overcome any obstacle. Dawn brought with it new hope for Arya Walker. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the gaps in the shutters, illuminating the hospital room where Vivian lay. Arya, who had spent all night watching over her mother's sleep, rubbed her tired eyes, but her heart was lighter than it had been in days. Julian quietly entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to Arya with a tired but comforting smile. "How is she?" Arya accepted the coffee gratefully. "Sleeping soundly. The new medicine seems to be helping." The siblings were silent for a moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of Vivian's chest. It was a moment of peace in the midst of the storm they had faced. "Arya," Julian began hesitantly, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I should have—" Arya interrupted him, placing her hand on his. "It's okay, Julian. You're here now, and that's what matters." The moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Leo entered, his face lighting up at the sight of Arya. "Good morning," he said softly. "I've brought some news." Arya and Julian approached, anxious. Leo continued. "I spoke to Dr. Harrington in Boston. He's willing to take on Ms. Clark's case immediately. The problem is the cost," Arya added, feeling the weight of reality bearing down on her again. Leo nodded. "Yes, but don't lose hope. I've made some calls. There's a foundation that helps patients with rare diseases. They're willing to cover part of the treatment." Julian frowned, doing some mental calculations. "That helps, but we're still a long way from what's needed." Just then Vivian stirred in bed, her eyes slowly opening. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from sleep. Arya rushed to her mother's side, holding her hand. "Mom, we found a doctor in Boston who can help you. We're trying to organize everything." Vivian looked at the worried faces around her and smiled faintly. "My dears, you don't have to worry so much about me. I've already lived a good life." "No, Mom," Julian interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't talk like that. We'll find a way." Leo, who had moved away to give the family some privacy, approached again. "Mrs. Clark, if I may, there is something we can try." All eyes turned to him, curious and hopeful. "There's a research program in Boston," Leo explained. "They're looking for patients with rare conditions for a study. If you're accepted, the treatment would be free." Arya felt her heart race. That would be incredible, but what are the chances? Leo hesitated. "Honestly, they're not high. The study is very selective, but it's worth a try." Julian was already in action, picking up his phone. "I'll call them right now. What's the name of the program?" As Julian made the call, Arya turned to her mother. "What do you think, Mom? Do you want to try it?" Vivian looked at the eager faces of her children and at the young nurse who had done so much for them. She felt a wave of love and gratitude. "Yes," she said softly. "Let's try." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Julian spent the day on the phone, talking to doctors, researchers, and hospital administrators. Arya was running around collecting medical documents and filling in endless forms. Leo, even off shift stayed to help, his constant presence a source of comfort to Arya. In a moment of calm, while Julian was away making copies of documents, Arya found herself alone with Leo. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice tinged with emotion, "for everything you've done." Leo smiled, his eyes shining with an emotion that Arya couldn't quite decipher. "No need to thank me. I care. With you, with your family." There was something in the way he said it, something in the way his eyes met hers, that made Arya's heart skip a beat. But before she could reply, Julian returned, interrupting the moment. "We have a chance," he announced, exultant. "They want to do a video interview with Mom tomorrow." The news was greeted with a mixture of joy and apprehension. It was a chance, yes, but only the first step on a long journey. That night, while Vivian slept, Arya found herself in the hospital cafeteria with Julian and Leo. Tiredness was visible on their faces, but there was also a fierce determination. "What if it doesn't work out?" Arya asked, verbalizing the fear they all shared. Julian took his sister's hand. "Then we'll find another way. We won't give up." Leo nodded in agreement. "You're not alone in this, I promise." Arya looked at the two men in front of her, feeling a wave of gratitude and affection. Her brother, who had returned when she needed him most, and Leo, a stranger who had become an indispensable ally in such a short time. As the night wore on, Arya allowed herself a moment of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain and full of obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. With her family reunited and new friends by her side, she knew they would face whatever challenges came their way. Tomorrow would bring the interview, a crucial step towards Vivian's cure. But regardless of the outcome, Arya knew they would keep fighting, united by the love and hope they had rediscovered in each other. The day of the video interview dawned with a mixture of hope and apprehension hanging over the hospital room. Arya was helping Vivian get ready, carefully combing her hair and adjusting her hospital gown so that she looked as presentable as possible. "You look beautiful, Mom," Arya said, her voice soft, trying to hide the tremor of anxiety. Vivian smiled weakly, her eyes tired but determined. "Thank you, dear. But remember, no matter what happens today, I'm already blessed to have you both by my side." Julian entered the room carrying a laptop. His face was tense, but he forced a confident smile. "Everything's ready. The call will start in 5 minutes." While Julian was setting up the computer, Arya felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Leo, who had arrived earlier to offer support. "How are you?" he asked softly, his eyes full of concern. Arya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few weeks on her shoulders. "Honestly, terrified. What if it's not enough? What if—" Leo interrupted her gently, taking her hands. "Hey, look at me. You've overcome so much. No matter what happens today, you'll face it together, and I'll be here, by your side." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was something growing between them, something that Arya didn't have the time or energy to fully explore, but which warmed her from the inside. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the video call starting. Everyone positioned themselves around Vivian's bed, with Arya and Julian on either side of their mother. The serious face of a middle-aged woman appeared on the screen. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Eleanor Reeves, coordinator of the research program. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Clark, Mr. Bennett, Ms. Walker." The interview began formally with questions about Vivian's medical history, symptoms and treatments already tried. Arya and Julian complimented their mother's answers when necessary, providing details that Vivian, in her weakened state, sometimes forgot. As the conversation progressed, Arya noticed a subtle change in Dr. Reeves's expression. The initial formality gave way to genuine interest, her eyes shining with what seemed to be a mixture of compassion and scientific curiosity. "Mrs. Clark," the doctor said, leaning closer to the camera, "your case is fascinating from a medical point of view. The way your condition developed is unique and could provide valuable insights for our research." Vivian nodded, her voice weak but determined. "If my experience can help other people, I'd be happy to take part." Dr. Reeves smiled, but her face soon turned serious again. "I must warn you, however, that experimental treatment can be rigorous. There will be side effects, and we can't guarantee positive results." Julian squeezed his mother's hand. "We understand the risks, doctor, but this may be our only chance." The doctor nodded understandingly. "Well, based on what I've seen and heard today, I believe that Mrs. Clark would be an excellent candidate for our program. I'd like to offer her a place on the study." The room erupted in a mixture of sighs of relief and restrained tears. Arya hugged her mother, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Dr. Reeves," Vivian said, her voice tinged with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to us." The doctor smiled gently. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Clark. I'll send you all the necessary details and documents later today. We look forward to seeing you in Boston next week." When the call ended, the room fell silent for a moment, everyone processing what had just happened. It was Leo who broke the silence, his voice full of restrained joy. "You've done it! This is incredible!" The celebration that followed was silent, respectful of the hospital environment but intense in its emotion. Hugs were exchanged, tears shed, and promises of a better future whispered. In the midst of the joy, however, Arya felt a twinge of apprehension. She moved away a little, leaning against the bedroom window. Leo, noticing her change of mood, approached. "What is it?" he asked softly. Arya hesitated, biting her lip. "It's just, what if it doesn't work out? What if it's too late?" Leo stared at her for a moment, his eyes full of understanding. Then, to Arya's surprise, he took her hand and gently pulled her out of the room. In the empty corridor, Leo turned to her, their hands still intertwined. "Arya, listen to me. Whatever happens from now on, you're not alone. Your mother has a real chance now, a chance she didn't have before. Focus on that." Arya nodded, feeling the tears she had held back for so long finally fall. "I know, it's been so hard. I almost did something terrible out of desperation. And now—" Leo pulled her into an embrace, and Arya allowed herself to collapse into his arms, sobbing against his chest. He held her tightly, murmuring words of comfort. When Arya finally calmed down, she pulled away a little, but not completely. Looking into Leo's eyes, she saw something that frightened and thrilled her at the same time. "Leo, she began, but was interrupted by Julian calling her name. "Arya, Dr. Harlan is here. He wants to talk to you." The moment between Arya and Leo shattered, reality brutally intruding. Arya felt her body stiffen, the fear and anger she had suppressed resurfacing. "I'll go with you," Leo said firmly, his hand finding hers again. Together they returned to the room where Dr. Harlan was waiting, his face a mask of false concern. "Miss Walker," he began, his voice oily, "I've come personally to—" "Get out of here," Arya interrupted him, her voice shaking with anger. "You have nothing more to say that I want to hear." Dr. Harlan seemed surprised by her boldness. "Now, be reasonable. I only wanted the best for your mother." "The best?" Julian entered the conversation, his voice dangerously low. "You tried to take advantage of my sister. You lied and manipulated when you should have been helping." Dr. Harlan paled, realizing he was cornered. "You don't understand. I'm a respected doctor. You're a predator, Leo said, stepping forward. And we have proof. I suggest you leave now before we call security. For a moment, it looked like Dr. Harlan was going to argue further. But then, seeing the determination on the faces in front of him, he stepped back. With one last look of contempt, he left the room. As the door closed behind him, Arya felt her legs go weak. Leo held her, gently guiding her to a chair. "It's over," he muttered. "He can't hurt you anymore." Vivian, who had watched the whole scene in silence, held out her hand to her daughter. "My brave girl," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Arya held her mother's hand, feeling the love and support of her family and friends around her. The future was still uncertain, but at that moment she knew that, together, they could face anything. Boston Airport was buzzing with activity that fall morning. Arya was carefully pushing Vivian's wheelchair with Julian at her side carrying her bags. The air was filled with anticipation and a palpable nervousness. "Is everything all right, Mom?" Arya asked, noticing the pallor on Vivian's face. Vivian smiled weakly, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little anxious." Julian put a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder. "It'll be all right. We're here with you." As they waited in line for check-in, Arya couldn't help but think of Leo. He had said goodbye to them at the airport of origin, his eyes filled with an emotion that Arya still couldn't name. "Call me when you arrive," he had said, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Walker." The counter attendant's voice brought her back to the present. "Your documents, please." While Arya dealt with the paperwork, Julian knelt down next to Vivian. "How are you really feeling, Mom?" he asked softly. Vivian looked at her son, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Julian. What if it doesn't work? What if it's too late?" Julian held his mother's hand tightly. "Hey, look at me. You're the strongest woman I know. You've raised 2 children on your own, overcome so many obstacles. This is just another challenge you're going to overcome." Vivian nodded, wiping away a stubborn tear. "You two are my strength, you know. I don't know what I'd do without you." The moment was interrupted by Arya, who returned with the boarding passes. "All set. Let's go." The journey to the hospital was silent, everyone lost in their own thoughts. When they finally arrived, they were greeted by Dr. A. Reeves, her face a mixture of professionalism and compassion. "Welcome," she said, holding out her hand. "We're very happy to have you here." As Dr. Reeves explained the procedures, Arya felt her phone vibrate. It was a message from Leo. "Thinking of you. Go ahead." Those simple words brought a smile to Arya's face, a small light in the midst of the anxiety of the moment. The next few hours were a whirlwind of tests, appointments, and paperwork. Vivian underwent a battery of tests, each one more exhausting than the last. Arya and Julian took turns by her side, offering support and comfort. It was during a break between tests that Arya finally had a moment to breathe. She moved away a little, finding a quiet corner in an inner garden of the hospital. Sitting down on a bench, she closed her eyes, letting the tears she had held back for so long finally fall. "Arya?" Julian's soft voice startled her. She quickly wiped away the tears, but it was too late to hide them. Julian sat down next to her, draping an arm over her shoulders. "Hey, it's okay not to be okay, you know." Arya let out a shaky laugh. "Look who's talking, Mr. Everything will be fine." Julian smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I have to be strong for both of you, but the truth, I'm terrified." Julian's honesty took Arya by surprise. For a moment she saw not the strong, confident older brother, but the frightened little boy he must have been when his father abandoned them. "You know," Julian continued, his voice low, When Dad left, I promised myself that I would always protect you and Mom. But now, I feel so powerless." Arya held her brother's hand. "You don't have to carry everything yourself, Julian. We're in this together, remember?" At that moment, Dr. Reeves appeared, her face serious. "Arya, Julian, can we talk?" Arya's heart raced. She exchanged an apprehensive glance with Julian before standing up. "Of course, doctor. Is there a problem?" Dr. Reeves hesitated for a moment. "The results of the preliminary examinations are in. Your mother's condition is more complex than we initially thought." Julian stepped forward, his voice tense. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that the treatment will be more intensive than we planned," the doctor explained. "It will be a long and difficult process, with significant side effects." Arya felt her legs go weak. Julian held her, his own face pale. "But there's still a chance of success, right?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. Dr. Reeves nodded slowly. "There is a chance, yes. But I need you to understand. It's going to be an uphill battle. Your mother will need all the support she can get." Arya and Julian exchanged a look. In that silent moment, a promise was made between siblings. They would face this together, no matter how difficult. "When do we start?" Arya asked, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. "Tomorrow morning," Dr. Reeves replied. "I suggest you spend the night with your mother. She'll need strength for what's to come." Let's join your We found her staring out the window, her face a mask of calm resignation. She turned when she heard the mender, and something in her expression changed at the sight of her children's tense faces. "You already know, don't you?" she asked softly. Arya ran to hug her mother, the tears she had been holding back finally escaping. Julian joined them, wrapping them both in his strong arms. "We'll get through this together, Mom," Julian murmured, his voice breaking. "You're not alone." Vivian stroked her children's hair, a sad smile on her lips. "I know, my loves, I know." That night, while Vivian slept, Arya went quietly out into the hallway. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over Leo's name for a long moment before finally pressing call. When he answered, his voice sleepy but immediately alert, Arya felt something break inside her. "Leo," she whispered, tears flowing freely. "I need you." On the other end of the line, Leo's voice was soft and comforting. "I'm here, Arya. I'm here." And in that hospital corridor, thousands of kilometers away from home, Arya allowed herself to be vulnerable. She cried, vented, and found comfort in Leo's gentle voice. The dawn would bring new challenges, the beginning of a long and uncertain battle. But that night, Arya clung to the promise that, no matter what happened, she was not alone. With her family by her side and Leo's support, even from a distance, she found the strength to face what was to come. Fall gave way to winter, and winter to spring. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Time seemed to flow differently within the aseptic walls of the hospital, marked not by seasons, but by cycles of treatment, tests, and endless waiting. Arya watched her mother through the glass window of the intensive care unit. Vivian was thinner, her hair now just a shadow of what it had once been, but her eyes still shone with the same fierce determination that Arya had always admired. "How is she today?" Julian's voice snapped Arya out of her thoughts. She turned to look at her brother, noticing the deep circles under his eyes, silent witnesses to the nights he had not slept. "Stable," Arya replied, her voice laden with exhaustion and reluctant hope. Dr. Reeves said that the latest test showed a slight improvement. Julian nodded, a tired smile playing on his lips. "Small victories, right?" That's how we win this battle." Arya agreed, remembering the words Leo had said to her in one of their many late-night phone calls. Healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. Every step counts. As if summoned by her thoughts, Arya's phone vibrated with a message from Leo. "Thinking of you. Any news?" Arya smiled, feeling a wave of warmth in her chest. Leo had become her safe haven during these turbulent months, always there even from a distance. She quickly typed a reply, promising to call back later. "You two should talk about it, you know," Julian commented, a mischievous glint in his tired eyes. Arya blushed slightly. "There's nothing to talk about. We're just two people who clearly care deeply about each other," Julian added, his tone gentle but firm. "Life is too short to let fear stop us from being happy, Arya." Before Arya could respond, Dr. Reeves appeared in the hallway, her face unreadable. "Arya, Julian, may I speak with you?" The siblings exchanged an apprehensive glance before following the doctor to her office. Arya's heart was hammering in her chest, fearing the worst but desperately clinging to hope. Dr. Reeves sat behind her desk, her eyes meeting Arya and Julian's with an intensity that made Arya hold her breath. "The results of the latest tests are in," the doctor began, her voice carefully neutral. "And I have to say, I'm impressed." Arya felt Julian squeeze her hand, both of them leaning forward anxiously. "Your mother's response to treatment has been remarkable," Dr. Reeves continued, a smile finally forming on her lips. "The cancer cells have decreased significantly. If this trend continues—" "Can she recover?" Julian interrupted, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. Dr. Reeves nodded slowly. "It's a real possibility now. We still have a long way to go, but yes, there's a very good chance of a full recovery." The office erupted in a mixture of laughter and tears. Arya threw herself into Julian's arms, both of them sobbing with relief and joy. Years of tension, fear, and uncertainty seemed to melt away, leaving in their place a hope so pure and bright that it almost hurt. When they finally calmed down, Arya turned to Dr. Reeves, her eyes glistening with tears. "Can we see her? Tell her." The doctor smiled gently. "Of course. She's awake and, I'm sure, anxious for news." The walk to Vivian's room seemed lighter now, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. When they entered, they found her mother sitting on the bed, a book on her lap. "My loves," Vivian smiled, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her children. "What? You look different." Arya sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's hand. "Mom, we have good news. Great news, actually." As Arya and Julian shared the news, Vivian's face transformed. Tears of joy streamed down her cheeks as she hugged her children, murmuring words of gratitude and love. "You two," Vivian said, her voice breaking with emotion, "have been my strength all this time. I don't know if I could have done it without you." Julian kissed his mother's forehead. "We're a family. We faced this together." The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotions. Calls were made, tears were shed, and plans for the future, so long postponed, began to take shape. That evening, while Vivian rested, Arya went out into the hospital garden. The spring air was charged with the scent of freshly opened flowers, an apt metaphor for the rebirth her family was experiencing. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over Leo's name for a moment before pressing call. When he answered, his voice immediately concerned, Arya felt her heart expand. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's going to be fine. My mom will be fine." On the other end of the line, she heard Leo's ragged breathing, followed by a laugh of pure joy. "Oh, Arya, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you." There was a pause, laden with unspoken words, long-suppressed feelings. Finally, Arya took a deep breath, Julian's words echoing in her mind. "Leo," she began, her heart hammering, "when all this is over, when we go home, I think we need to talk about us." The silence on the other end of the line made Arya hold her breath. Then Leo's voice, soft and full of emotion. "I can't wait, Arya." When she hung up, Arya looked up at the starry sky, feeling like she was on the threshold of something new and wonderful. The journey had been long and difficult, full of moments of despair and darkness. But here they were, on the other side, stronger, more united, and with a bright future ahead of them. Arya closed her eyes, letting the evening breeze caress her face. She thought of her mother, fighting bravely against the disease. She thought of Julian, who had left everything to be by their side. She thought of Leo, whose constant presence, even at a distance, had been a beacon of hope in the darkest moments. And for the first time in a long time, Arya allowed herself to dream of the future. A future where her mother would be healthy, where her family would be united, where she could explore her growing feelings for Leo without fear or guilt. When she returned to the hospital room, Arya found Julian asleep in a chair next to Vivian's bed. Her mother was awake, looking at her children with a love so deep it made Arya's heart ache. "Come here, darling," Vivian called softly, holding out her hand. Arya snuggled up next to her mother as she used to when she was a child. Vivian stroked her hair, her voice low and full of emotion. "You know, all this time, I've been afraid," Vivian confessed. "Not of death, but of leaving you two. Of not seeing you grow up, fall in love, fulfill your dreams." Arya felt tears burn her eyes. "Oh, Mother." "But now," Vivian continued, a smile in her voice, "now I have a second chance, and I promise you, my dear, that I will enjoy every moment of it." Arya hugged her mother, feeling the love and gratitude overflowing in her chest. "Us too, Mom. Us too." As the night wore on, Arya reflected on the journey they had traveled. From the depths of despair to the heights of hope, they had faced every obstacle together. And now, with the future opening up before them like a new dawn, Arya knew that, no matter what came, they would be ready. Because in the end, that's what mattered: love, family, the courage to face the unknown, and the strength to get up, no matter how many times you fall. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support inspires us to bring new, exciting stories. Support the channel by clicking the link in the first comment or scanning the QR code on your screen. Share this story with someone special and leave a comment about what you'd like to see next. Get ready for the amazing story that is unfolding on your screen right